Some of you may already know this about me, but I attend a event in the UK called Empire, the Larp event here, and it's run by Profound Decisions. It's a great event. There's a huge amount of kind of history and lore to the story and to the kind of world building. There's a character built into the lore called the Reaper, and during the masquerade of the Reaper, they come along and they do certain rituals and events for other characters. Particularly characters, or I think only characters in the league. Huge amount of stuff about that, and there's also lots of other characters for other different nations and all sorts. But anyway, the Reaper this time is going to be a friend of mine, is taking on the role, and they've kindly approached me and asked if I could make them a scythe to go with the character. I thought it was a good opportunity to show some techniques in how to make a LARP-safe scythe or battle axe or anything with a kind of long shaft and a big blade at the end of it. It can be a bit more tricky than making just a sword. Anyway, starting as normal, we start with our core. I'm using a 11 or 12 millimeter core here. It gives you a bit more rigidity over the length of it. Use something like a 10 mil core on this and it's going to flop and wave around, especially once you get a weight on one end of it. So you want to make sure that you've got a slightly thicker core for this. And then you simply start by marking out your template. Definitely make a plan before you start cutting up the foam. So I'm going to use 10mm medium density foam again, and I'm going to cut it into 5 strips, which are going to form my 5 layers for my staff for the scythe blade to go onto. And now I'm tracing around my template and cutting it out into each layer, so that there's a kind of rough shape forming as I build these layers up. The middle layer needs to have the core section taken away, so check the core against that. Make sure that there's no areas coming too close to the core on the sides. I want it to have a kind of a bit of a bend in it, and to kind of give this false impression of a kind of warped core. And then just cut away the core, put some hockey tape on either end of the sanded down core. And then do a dry fit just to check it's going to fit nice and snug. Then you want to apply the glue to the inside of where the core's going to go, and obviously around the whole core after you've sanded it, giving it a bit of a rough surface. And carefully place it inside, and then squash down either side firmly to secure the core to this central piece of foam. Now the core is going to be slightly wider than the foam, so as you're pinching down, try and get it to the central part of the core. It's not too essential, but it's not as simple as just pushing it flush like a blade, which is 10mm core and a 10mm foam. This is 12mm core and 10mm foam. Then I'm going to mark out where I want to put the blade. So now I'm going to build up the core from either side, so it's going to be 5 layers in total from the middle one, so 2 either side of the central piece, and this is the first layer on one side. It's easy to position the already cut piece onto the kind of rectangle first and then cut away. So I'm just going to press that down firmly. Use a rolling pin or just press with your hands very firmly to activate the contact cement. This is the part where I remembered I hadn't put the little square of fabric at the tip to stop the tip from any lateral movement. So I'm just going to pry away that piece that I've applied, and this time I'm using Kevlar, little squares of Kevlar. I bought a big sheet of Kevlar last time. I got a load of polyurethane, and it wasn't too expensive, but you can use pleather here or any kind of fabric which is strong enough and isn't the core isn't going to push through. And I'm doing the same for the other sides. Draw a kind of rough area where it's going to glue, so you're not wasting too much of the contact cement. Glue it down and then cut away the excess, building up that core. Here I'm going to add a kind of grip point. On a side they have that handle sticking out. I think usually it comes out at pretty strange angles to make it more convenient for scything. But this is a fantasy scythe, so I'm going to keep it parallel with the blade. It's going to come out at the same shape, so it's got a nice silhouette. Give that 3 layers, and then at this point I'm going to apply a bit of Kevlar. I'm just going to make a T shape to prevent any kind of tearing down the line. There's going to be another layer of foam over this whole piece, and that Kevlar will stop the handle from being torn off. This is where I realized that the whole staff itself was a bit too long, so I cut off the end and then pulled back the foam to reveal the kind of bare core, which means I can now attach the blade independently from the core, which just means that I can kind of make sure that it's nice and firm. Again, I can apply this in parts. I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the handle with the Kevlar, and ensure that there is a nice chunky bit of Kevlar or whatever fabric you are using. Kevlar is good because it's incredibly thin and incredibly strong and won't tear. So that's going to go at the top of where the blade comes away from the staff, and this will prevent it from being torn off if it gets caught on someone's shield or someone's weapon or somebody. Same principle applies. Nice thin layer of the contact cement on both sides. Let it get touch dry and then press it firmly down to activate the cement. And that's kind of roughly it. And then what I'm going to do is just build up that staff so that it's another layer either side. This is going to seal in my grip and the blade itself. So then I'm going to let that cure overnight, press down with these sandbags. Cool, so it's the next day. I'm going to start shaping it on the sander. I had started to use the belt sander here, but quickly realized that the bumpy shape of the staff has made it quite difficult for me to get in there with this belt sander. So I'm going to have to pretty much sand the entire thing with the Dremel. You can use a hand sander here, but that would obviously take even longer. The Dremel is just a case of taking your time and working your way methodically up and down. And that's it, just work your way up, take your time, keep checking as you go, going back to the Dremel. Once I'm happy with the rough shape, I'm moving on to the blade. And it's the same principle with the swords. I start by cutting away an angle at where the sharp edge will be, just to save some of that sanding time. Going with the Dremel to smooth it all off, and then, yeah, I've got a rough shape of my scythe. It's not too floppy. The core is nice and firm, which is great. I've made weapons in the past with too thin a core and they've gone incredibly floppy and not passed weapon check. So this should pass without any trouble. Now to work on some of the details. I want to create a kind of attachment to the top where the metal blade is attaching to the wooden staff itself. So that's just going to be quite simple. And for the handle and grip, I want it to be kind of wrapped in a leather. So I'm just making strips of 1mm foam and using carpet tape to kind of wrap it around the grip to give a kind of look of worn leather. Now to make the rivets for the attachment of the blade, I'm going to use a technique where you use a copper tube to cut out the foam. This doesn't really work on 1mm foam at all. It's more about the pressure that you're applying rather than the cutting action of the pipe. Anyway, that gives you a 10mm thick little circle, and you can then cut that down into thinner sections for your rivets. Now I'm going to start working on the texture of the wood. To begin with, I'm just using a scalpel and a heat gun just to kind of split open the wood in a kind of grain effect. Then I wanted to add a bit of detail from one of my pommels that I've made. I've made these pommels in a mold, and it's quite simply just molded foam. But I'm going to use the front of the skull face and attach it to the top of the blade. The Reapers for the League are all about skulls, so I thought why not put a couple of skulls on his scythe. So they're going to sit on the side here, either side, so I've just attached them with the contact cement, and then we have some of the details done. And now I'm using a soldering iron or wood burning tool to kind of carve more defined grains into the wooden staff. This takes a long time and you want to get a good audiobook on. You can do the same thing in the bladed area, add a bit of battle damage. And now I'm adding kind of a hammered metal look to the top of the blade, just to give it a bit of texture for when it's painted. Give it a good check everything's nice and firm. It's had a good day or two to dry as well now, so it should be almost as strong as it's going to be. The latex obviously is going to make it even stronger, but yeah, give it a test, fail, carry on. Next day, I've come back and I wanted to actually add a kind of spiraled wood effect to the whole staff. It's like a twisted, aged piece of wood. I think it will give a lot more character to this piece. I'm going to go up and down with my Sharpie, and now I'm just going over it with the Dremel, carving the detail into it. And you can see there the kind of spiral effect. Use the heat gun to kind of close all those open bits of foam up, and there, more or less there with the shape of it. Now to apply the latex. So I've completely moved now over to using an air gun. The reason is it's just so much quicker to apply the latex, and you can apply a nice thin coat over the whole thing. Here you see that I haven't quite figured out that there is a huge amount of latex dust that is created when you use an air gun. So for that one it was pretty open. Moving forward I made a bit more of a kind of tent for me to apply the latex in. 5 coats in black, then I did a brown coat over the wood, and then I moved on to painting everything else by hand. I'm using Hexflex paints, but you can use kind of any acrylic paint. You can mix acrylic paints with latex as well. I do recommend any kind of paint that remains a bit flexible once it's dry, because you don't really want it cracking as it gets used. Now I'm applying a bit of a black wash into the recesses of the wood, just to make them stand out a bit more against the brown. And just taking my time, painting as I go. I'm trying to look at references as well, just to try and make sure that I'm sticking to a kind of fairly realistic look, and using different techniques like dry brushing on the blade here, adding a bit of lighter silvers. Started with a dark silver, added to it with a dry brushed light silver, and then I'm using light silver again on the kind of nicks where the metal has been exposed from damage. And yeah, we're getting there with the detail. So now I'm using my old favorite, the rub and buff, just using that on the kind of edge of the blade, just to give it a nice shiny metallic look. Rub and buff's not amazing on swords and things that get a lot of impact, but on this there shouldn't be too much impact. It's more kind of visual and more of a look, so it should be able to get away with having the rub and buff on the blade. Now I'm applying a Hexflex clear coat over the whole piece. This will kind of seal in all that paint, particularly over the rub and buff. This will help stop it from coming off on anyone's clothes or just getting worn out over time. It'll give a bit more of a flexible coat over the whole thing and protect that paint. I haven't finished painting yet, but I think it's worth adding the odd clear layer as you go, just to make sure that it's nice and flexible. It also removes any tackiness that the paint may have. Now I'm going to add a bit of a dry brush over the wood, just to bring out some of the lighter grains, kind of almost highlight the whole thing. Trying to avoid those dark recesses so that they remain nice and contrasty to the overall look. It's a simple dry brush technique. You just put paint on the brush, rub most of the paint off on a tissue, and then apply it over the piece. The fatter your brush, like this makeup brush that I'm using, the kind of easier it is to do large areas. And now I'm just adding a bit more kind of differentiation in the blade. Some areas where I'm highlighting with dry brushing, and some areas where I'm bringing back down again with the darker colors. It adds to a nice kind of variation over the whole thing. I've gone back in now with the rub and buff because I think I need the whole blade area to be a lot lighter, a lot more shiny and metallic than the rest of it. Now I'm using a cloth and a tiny bit of isopropyl alcohol on that cloth to kind of smooth out that rub and buff and make it look a bit more, make it stand out a little bit less and help it blend in with the other colors a bit better. And that's kind of it with the paint job. I'm liking how kind of dark and dirty it looks. He's a kind of Grim Reaper character, so it doesn't need to be too vibrant. And now I'm applying a bit more of that kind of sealant over the blade itself, just with the spray on. Sometimes when you apply the Isoflex, it does pull the paint around because it's quite aggressive as a material. So you want to make sure that there's a little seal between it and the paint. Now to open the Isoflex, make sure that you've got the top covered with a cloth, because gas can build up inside and you can get a bit of a spurt. So yeah, it's never happened to me, but I've always just made sure that I've opened it with a cloth on top just in case it does happen. And by this point you want to have protective clothing on completely. So make sure you've got some good gloves and long sleeve top, and absolutely have a respirator. So this stuff's awful. It's one of the worst things I've ever used smell wise, and it's incredibly carcinogenic. So you need to make sure that you're using it in a well ventilated area and with any kind of face mask respirator that helps filter out those fumes. And yeah, 24 hours later, it's fully dry. There's a little bit of a tack to it with the Isoflex, and there's obviously Isoflex dries quite glossy, which is a look that people want. Not necessarily what I want, and as you can see here on the blade, I've probably added a little bit too much Isoflex, and it's yellowed some of the blade there. Right, to bring down some of that shine, I'm going to talc the whole thing. Just brushing on talcum powder here, and then I'm going to go in with a cloth and rub off most of it. This just helps remove some of that kind of Isoflex shine. Now to seal and protect the blade part, which I don't really mind being shiny, I'm using a silicone spray. The silicone spray is going to be applied to the whole weapon as well, but I'm kind of focusing more talc on the wooden part, and a little bit of talc on the blade just to bring down some of that shine, but just not as much. And as you can see, it's incredibly flexible now. Anyway, that's kind of it. That's now this is me attempting to show you in daylight to get a bit more of a kind of look, but it's quite hard to catch in the daylight because the colors are quite subtle. But I hope you get a good idea of the overall look and feel of this piece, and hopefully my friend is going to be happy with how this turned out. It's quite big. I'm 6'3", and it's a big weapon. Great, so if you have any questions about how to make LARP safe weapons, please drop them in the description. Check out my other videos. I'll also share a load of videos that have taught me how to make these things. I pretty much learned everything on YouTube. So yeah, I'll share everything in the description. If anyone has anything specific for me to focus on next, let me know. I've got a Patreon, and I would like to put a shout out to Eleanor Davidson, who's my most recent Patreon, and Ultimate for your continued support. Thanks very much. Hopefully my friend likes it, and hopefully we get to have an event in September. Everything's been cancelled up to this point. The last event this year would be September, so fingers crossed that it all goes ahead, and yeah, we can give him his weapon. Cool. Thanks very much for watching. Take care. Cool.